It gives me enormous pleasure today to welcome George Webb. Now, George and I are sitting literally on opposite sides of the world. So, George, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, and then we're going to talk a little bit about why you have this fascination with Winston Churchill. I find this intriguing. So, George, before we start, can you tell me who you are, what you do, and how long you've been a member of the International Churchill Society?
Yes, absolutely. My name is George Webb, and I am a patent attorney. I'm an academic, and I'm a Texan. So I'll explain each of those. I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and went to college at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Then I went to law school at Tulane University back in New Orleans. I studied engineering as an undergraduate and then law as a graduate degree. So that combination naturally indicates into patent law, which is what I practiced for a number of years as an attorney in private practice. And several years ago, I had the opportunity to come back to my undergraduate alma mater at Rice in Houston and join the School of Engineering, where I serve as an advisor to our students and our faculty on intellectual property matters. And I teach a couple of classes. I have an additional appointment at Rice in the Baker Institute for Public Policy, and I've served in a number of volunteer roles at Rice over the years. So that's kind of briefly who I am. And I've had a compelling interest in Winston Churchill for many years, probably since I was an adolescent, when I first learned of and came to appreciate his role in the Second World War, his oratory that rallied the British people and really people around the world to the Allied cause and made such a important difference in those really eventful years at the beginning of the war. And the more I've learned about him, the more I've wanted to learn. He's one of those interesting figures where the more you peel back the layers, the more you discover that's interesting.
Absolutely. And George, you say you became aware of him as an adolescent, and you very kindly sent me copies of two papers that you wrote. And one of them, I absolutely love the comment that your tutor put on it. And he said he asked for perfection, and he got it. And this was dated, I don't wish to embarrass you, but it was dated 1982, which is over 40 years ago. So
that's right.
When did can you remember when you first heard of him or became aware of him? And certainly, again, forgive me if I'm wrong, but what you do today doesn't seem to bear any connection to this love of history that you developed.
I would say that's right. I'd say it's a bit ironic. I've been a passionate student of history, a lover of history for most of my adolescent and adult life, but I've never done anything professional with that interest. But one thing I think that I do appreciate very much about Winston Churchill, and it does sort of reflect my professional interest, is the priority he placed on clear and eloquent communication, both speaking and writing. And, for myself, certainly as an attorney, it's a fundamentally important professional quality, but it's also something I valued, again, all my adolescent and adult life. I've always been someone who really cared about writing carefully, speaking carefully about sort of the nuances of expression and the most effective way to convey ideas. And I think Winston Churchill was one of the first people, and probably one of the foremost people I've ever read about, who really made an intentional craft of that. And that's something that I think is really impressive and intriguing to me. The papers that you mentioned, so I'll talk about those a little bit. Those were about John Churchill, the first Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough. And the story of how I became so interested in the Duke of Marlborough is this. When I was in, I think, middle school, I just became interested in military history, like a lot of boys of that age might be. And I had heard of Julius Caesar and I had heard of Napoleon and what great generals they were. And I read a book I think my father had given me for my birthday, which was sort of a sweeping book about military history. And it mentioned this British general named the Duke of Marlborough. And I thought it was really interesting. And the book sort of made the point that he was, perhaps the best there's ever been as far as effectiveness as a commander, both tactically and strategically. And I thought, well, that was really interesting. I want to read more about him. Then early in high school, it was when I was 16, I guess, we had to write a major paper that was sort of the capstone project for the entire year in our Western civilization class. And I chose to write about the Duke of Marlborough because I had become really interested in sort of what made him such a good commander, what made him the one that historians were saying was one of the best generals of all time. And I really got interested in reading about his battles, about his campaigns, and about his leadership. The other thing that was sort of significant about that, bringing back to the earlier topic of kind of quality of writing and quality of communication, in my research on John Churchill as the first Duke of Marlborough, and particularly the War of the Spanish Succession, I felt like I was sort of absorbing the atmosphere of the early 18th century and regimental warfare. And I really got enthusiastic about it, spent an inordinate amount of time and gathered an inordinate amount of detail. And then, of course, faced the challenge of compressing all this detail into a readable paper. But anyway, I did a pretty good job, and my teacher was kind enough to notice that.
You mentioned John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. And at what point did you then think, okay, I need to include Winston in this as well?
I knew about Winston Churchill a little bit before I started learning about John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. And I thought, I knew Winston Churchill was the heroic leader of the Second World War, in which my dad fought. My dad was a veteran of the Second World War. So that is probably one of the things that made that have a special place of interest for me. Honestly, I think at the time when I was learning about John Churchill, I didn't think of his connection to Winston Churchill, his family relationship to Winston Churchill, as anything more than sort of one of those neat coincidences of history, So I didn't group them together in any sort of examples of a pattern or anything like that. I just thought, wow, they're two great leaders, very different leaders, but two great leaders who one happens to be a descendant of the other. But Winston himself, of course, is very conscious, as I learned much later when I read his biographies. He was very conscious of being the descendant of John Churchill and very conscious of trying to learn from his famous ancestor's leadership.
He felt very much that he'd inherited John Churchill's leadership qualities. And again, having read your paper, I thought it was really interesting to learn how John Churchill had used tactics that hadn't really been seen before. And do you think Winston did that at all during the Second World War, for example? Do you think he kind of surprised the enemy?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And that really is a good example of one of the things I mentioned earlier, which is that the more you learn about Winston, the more you peel back the layers, the more interesting it gets. And, the sort of 30,000-foot view is that he was a great orator whose oratory saved the day in 1940. And that's all absolutely correct, right? But one of the things I think is little known is how much Churchill cared about innovation and technology, innovation, not just technical innovation, but innovation in tactics, innovation in strategy, trying things that were different, and of course, his support of technological innovation. And I first started to learn about it in the context of the Second World War, where, he was always pushing his ministers, let's try this, let's try that, coming up with different schemes, some of which were not going to work and some of which were absolutely brilliant and essential. His support of, the application of sonar to the bow of the Atlantic, his support of the code breaking at Bletchley Park and so on were all really good examples in the Second World War. But then the more I read about his earlier career, one thing that's really striking is his advocacy of innovation in the First World War. The credit mostly goes to others, but he is the reason the tank was developed. He wasn't the technical inventor of it, but he was the person whose instigation and instigation and initiative led to the actual development of tanks, as he sought an alternative to having, gallant men chew barbed wire on the Western Front. And so I think that's one of the things about Churchill that is lesser known, but just makes him all the more, fascinating and intriguing a character, is his thirst for innovation and his constant encouragement of innovation.
And again, with always with my Blenheim hat, we would lay claim to being part of the reason that he was like that, because his uncle, the 8th Duke of Marlborough, who was Duke from 1883 till 1892, was actually in communication with Edison about the development of the phonogram. And so, we believe very firmly that he was aware that his uncle was a scientist, etc., and that, of course, he was open to embracing new ideas, new technology. And as you know, he had a very short-lived career as a pilot.
It's good. It's probably just as well that his piloting was short-lived, or else he would probably have been short-lived.
So it is interesting, and you're right. His support of innovation goes back way before the Second World War. I think you're absolutely spot on. I would say that's a great strength. What would you see as Churchill's weakness, or did he have a weakness?
Well, he certainly had weaknesses. I mean, number one, we all do, but number two, someone of sort of that much force and influence, I think even the small weaknesses are magnified. So, the one that I've learned is most commonly mentioned among historians and biographers is judgment, a certain sort of impetuousness, and maybe a tendency at times to cling to what's ultimately the losing side of a question. That's certainly something that has been written about a lot. I can sort of empathize with that. I can sort of empathize with someone who, has an ideal that matters a lot to them, and it may not be where the trends are going, and it may not be the popular opinion, but they cling to it at sort of more cost than is prudent. I could certainly appreciate that. One of the things, just on a personal level, one of the things about Churchill is that a person that I would enjoy associating with, right? And I think he would be fantastic company. I don't think there's much debate about that. I think he would be an absolute blended companion to spend time with. I'm not sure at the end of the day, would he really be like your closest friend? I don't know. That's harder to say.
He was incredibly loyal to his friends and family. But yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Definitely good company, definitely interesting company. How do you feel, you clearly respect him as a leader, as a wartime leader. And how do you think he fared as a husband and father?
Well, it's interesting. This is a question of first impression for me, because I know about Winston's family history and something about the lives of his children, but I don't know, I've never really evaluated or assessed that aspect. So I feel a little sheepish in opining. But, on the negative side, I mean, you can sort of look, his kids had fairly difficult lives in some sense. There was a lot of difficulty, marriages that weren't successful, alcoholism, which was, as I understand, just absolutely devastating for his son Randolph. Of course, those things happen in all kinds of families, and certainly in many British aristocratic families at the time, they weren't uncommon. So, by modern standards, you might say, well, he was not, he must not have been a wholly admirable father, but I can't really I can't really assess his fatherhood methods or his parenting methods. One thing I can say that means a lot to me is the devotion between Winston and Clementine is absolutely inspirational. And I'm blessed to have a wife who is devoted to me, and I'm devoted to her, and we are different, but we are each other's strength in so many ways. And I see some of that. I see a lot of that in the relationship that Mr. and Mrs. Churchill had, and I respect and admire that a great deal.
I hope you won't mind me saying and sharing with our audience that you recently came to the UK. I believe it was a special wedding anniversary.
Yeah, it wasn't a cardinal number, but it was our 21st wedding anniversary. And we came in conjunction with the International Churchill Conference.
And you visited, again, you came and visited Blenheim, which was lovely. Now, yes. Is your wife a fan of Winston Churchill? Or was she when you set out?
She was not when we set out. Like many of my sort of quirky interests and hobbies, she's sort of become a fan, as I have of hers over the years. It's interesting. So one of the questions you had asked me a while ago was, which I didn't get to answer, was when I became a member of the International Churchill Society. So last year, in 2022, the International Churchill Conference was in Kansas City, Missouri, and it just so happened that I had some business to do in Kansas City. So I sort of arranged my business trip to coincide with the conference and then stayed an extra day or two and went to the conference. And the conference was absolutely terrific. I thought the speakers were marvelous, very interesting, extremely polished. The people I met were an absolute delight. The conference was really a terrific experience in every way. And I came home from the conference telling my wife what a marvelous time I had. And then I mentioned to her the 2023 conference was going to be in Edinburgh, and she said, "Well, we have to go." So she was thrilled that I was so thrilled about it. She was thrilled for the opportunity to go to Edinburgh, and which is a city we visited a couple of times before, and we absolutely adore. She and her mother actually gave me society membership for Christmas of 2022. That was their Christmas gift to me, was a membership in the society. And
this year was your first visit to Blenheim Palace as well, I believe.
That's correct. I've always wanted to go to Blenheim, but honestly, it's the first time I'd ever been to kind of the middle part of England. I'd been many times to London and some areas around London, many times to Scotland, but somehow had never made it to the middle part of England. So
what were your impressions of Winston Churchill's birthplace?
Well, it was a little more approachable than I thought. I guess the pictures I have seen conveyed such almost an unapproachable grandeur, right? And I don't know, somehow I thought it was gonna have the feel of Versailles or something like that. In just its sort of untouchable impressiveness. And it is impressive and it is grand. There's plenty of grandeur, don't get me wrong, but I don't know. I think from the moment I actually got inside the building, I felt like, oh, well, okay, this is not unapproachable. It's massively impressive, but this is, I mean, people lived here. And I thought that was kind of neat. Obviously, very, very comfortable and well-off people lived there, but it was a home. And I thought that was sort of interesting. I think one of the things I loved about it too was all of the paintings and tapestries of Marlborough's battles. I recognized some of them from my history researches years ago. The painting, I forget who it's by, but Marlborough leaning over on his horse and sending the dispatch from Blenheim. I recognized some of them, but to sort of be right there and see it, that was really a neat feeling. I mean, obviously it's an artist's representation. It wasn't a photograph, but it still felt like almost as if I was looking at a photograph of the battle,
How did you feel standing in Churchill's birth room?
The thing that most surprised me is not tucked away down a wing. It's kind of really close to the front door and sort of right in the middle of everything. I think that's what really struck me. And I forget the circumstances, but I guess they didn't have a lot of time. They had to just grab the first available room. So that was probably the biggest impression I had, was that it was not down a long suite of down a long hallway with suites of bedrooms and that sort of thing. His parents didn't live there, right? They were just visiting when the time came. So it sort of makes sense that they would have, just grabbed the first available room, and Jenny would not have been in an apartment or something like that.
Yeah, there are various versions of the story, and he was born on St. Andrew's Day, so patron saint of Scotland. And his parents were visiting for a St. Andrew's Day ball. So they would have been staying for a number of days, because travel in those days, you couldn't just pop up on the express from Paddington kind of thing. So you're absolutely right. The story is that Jenny went into labour and she was made comfortable in the room very, very near to the long library where the dancing was taking place. And it is quite a modest room when you think of the man, but quite nice for that, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the other thing that struck me about it is that it is, how can I say, it is not set aside and one of the most visited places in the palace, I'm sure, but it doesn't have, it's not treated with elevated grandiosity. It really is still just the simple bedroom that it was, right? It doesn't have it doesn't seem like it's a temple to a god or anything like that.
It's not a shrine. That's for sure.
Right. That's exactly what I'm trying to say. It's not a shrine.
Okay. And again, just going back to John Churchill, so Blenheim Palace was a reward for his military prowess. Do you think it's a fitting reward, or could we have done better?
Well, I don't think you could have done better, although it's one of those sort of double-edged gifts, right? As I understand it, is that when someone is given a palace like that, well, then they also have to maintain it and live in the style that palace owner is expected to live in. So it's not a gift without cost. But I do kind of think, imagine today if sort of successful generals were given $100 million estates by the legislature, that would be pretty strange. One of the things I learned a lot at the at Blenheim Palace, thanks to your very knowledgeable and enthusiastic guide, was just how much the Churchills were dependent on the vagaries of royal fortune, and how Sarah Churchill was a favorite of the crown until she was not.
Absolutely. And therein lies a whole another story, really. So, George, we're celebrating in 2024 the 150th anniversary of Winston Churchill's birth. So I still find it fascinating that he is still relevant today, and that there is an International Churchill Society, for example, and it appeals to people like yourself who are the other side of the world. What do you think his relevance is today? Why hasn't he just faded into obscurity?
I think there's several reasons. One is the significance of the event for which he is most remembered, his role in the Second World War. I mean, the Second World War is probably the largest single event, the largest historical phenomenon with a discrete starting and end point and discrete title that has ever happened on Earth, and certainly the largest single event in modern history. And he was the outstanding figure on the winning side in an absolutely epochal event. So I think that ensures that he'll always have a place in history, much like Abraham Lincoln in the United States, as an example, as a kind of the most interesting figure on the successful and righteous side of one of the most significant conflicts that's ever happened. So that's one reason. I think a couple other reasons have to do with his personality. One is just that he was such a larger than life character. The more you learn about a lot of historical characters, the more you realize, well, okay, they were good at what they did, but that was sort of it. Churchill was such a strong personality that the more you learn about him, the more he becomes interesting, I think. So that's another factor as well. But I think one reason for his endurance that's overlooked is the sense of humor that permeated all of his writings, all of his life, that came through in his style and his approach to everything. And I think that resonates with people. I think it's really, I think people really like to think of a terrific leader who was also funny, who could also see the humor in things, who could laugh at himself. I think that's something that resonates with people and hopefully always will. There's so much, it seems like there are times today when there's so much pressure to be serious about everything. And it's really refreshing to think of someone who could be a really impactful and successful leader who was not always serious about everything.
And I think that's such a good point, because, if you ever look up his quotes and wit and wisdom, etc., there's a quote for everything. And it's always amusing and it's always accurate. And I think that's a super point. And George, again, just to belabor the American connection a little bit. Now, Churchill's mother was American, and I know you're passionate about him. Are you in the absolute minority, or are there other like-minded people around who still have a passion for Churchill?
Well, if you look at the International Churchill Conference, it was just held in Edinburgh, mind you, the overwhelming majority of the attendees were from the United States. So Churchill is very much continues to be, studied and admired here in the United States. And it seems like most of the best works that have been coming out, and there have been some very good ones in the last few years, are by British historians and British biographers. But I suspect the readers, I suspect a great many of the readers are American. So yes, absolutely, very much still studied and by many people admired here in the U.S. One of the things that I appreciate in particular about Churchill is that, he, as an American, it's certainly flattering to know that he had high opinions of the importance of the United States. That's certainly gratifying to those of us here on this side of the Atlantic. But one thing that particularly resonates with me is he had a sense of the common interests of all of the English-speaking democracies. And now, obviously, in terms of scale of population, the United States and Britain are so much larger than Canada and Australia and New Zealand and so on. But the sense of kind of a common legal heritage, a common linguistic heritage, and fundamentally common values of democracy and individual liberty, I think that resonates with me a lot. I think that's really important. And one of the things I'm gratified to know is that even though that group of countries is not, I guess in public discourse, it's not, widely spoken of as a community of interest. I know that sort of behind the scenes, there is an intense amount of diplomatic and military cooperation at all levels between those countries. And I think that's a good thing for the world.
George, I can't thank you enough for spending the time to come and talk to me this afternoon. I'm hoping that you'll come over next year and celebrate the 150 years since his birth.
I would love to, and this has been a real kick. This has been a tremendous pleasure and an honor. To think that anyone wanted to talk to me on the record about a couple of my heroes. That's really neat. That's really a nice feeling.
And it's, as I say, and I was just so, just so interested to know why is he relevant? And it's been super talking to you. And I have now a far better understanding of, how important he still is and how valid he still is in America. And I know that he's still very important in this country as well. And long may it last.